like he was. So in effect, we've bankrupted a lot of our diplomacy. Again, that goes beyond the immediate topic of what's next for Libya, but it was should have been an important ingredient in the decision making. Now, Jeff's described a situation in which it's not a stalemate and not a static situation, and I would agree with that, but I think it's also correct to say we haven't had a decisive military trend emerge yet. And I really don't disagree at all with what he described. NATO air power, has made a difference, but it's been subject to a number of limitations, including the issue of collateral damage, which is inevitable in these sorts of things, and all the political and public relations sensitivities that go with that. And related to that is the use of the human shield tactics by the regime. Reprehensible though they may be, they do represent a limitation in terms of what we can do. I think for some time, or at least going back early in the rebellion, the greatest hope, and this corresponds to Jeff's possible outcome number 2, the greatest hope for a quick resolution of this was a crumbling of the regime with all kinds of defections. And for a while it looked like it might have been getting close to that situation, particularly with the defection of Musa Kusa, with whom I dealt 12 years ago on some of those negotiations I referred to. But there was very little that came after that, although now it appears that the oil minister may have defected. It's not certain, but the regime seems to be talking as if it's a fait accompli. So that might, we'll see what happens in the next few days if that starts something new. I think what has been the main source of resistance to that happening, and Jeff's basically described it, is the hang together, hang separately idea. You've got a core of support in the regime. It's not just support, and then there is some genuine support in the sense of people like Muammar, but more people who are implicated themselves in the deeds and misdeeds of the regime. And however bad they see the situation, they don't see any way to get out of it and take their life with them. Certainly not inside Libya itself. Over time, that attrition process may get to the point, and this was one of Jeff's other outcomes, where the balance will be tipped against the regime. But I would agree with the time frame that it's at least a matter of weeks, if not a couple of months. Now, if we're talking about political settlements instead, we've heard demands that Qaddhafi has to go before we have any kind of negotiations about a new political order. That sounds like a non-starter to me, if you think even 2 seconds about Qaddhafi's incentive structure. He has every reason to fight to the bitter end as long as he can, if that's the arrangement. And especially since now the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has made him a wanted man. Saudi Arabia has been a place of exile for a lot of people in the Muslim world. I can guarantee you it won't be the place of exile for Muammar Gaddafi. I think I heard something a while back. Uganda made some sound that they might accept Gaddafi, and that might be Uganda's way of getting back to the Saudis for taking in Idi Amin. I think looking at what do we do with Qaddhafi, and I would note that in contrast to the demand that he goes first before there are any talks, I would call attention to the International Crisis Group's position on this, and that is ceasefire first, and then we talk. And if you have any hope of getting the regime to agree to something that's going to start saving lives in the short term, that would have to be it. And that would leave Gaddafi in place, but it does not tell you what's going to happen over the long term, especially if a continued blockade, sanctions, everything else ensues, coupled with material support on the other side in the east for the rebels. I think in wrestling with these problems, we're seeing some of the conflict that goes back to that fuzzy set of goals with regard to the initial intervention. Are we more interested in saving lives, which supposedly was what this was all about, or are we more interested in getting rid of Gaddafi? And if you think about what I just mentioned in terms of sequence of ceasefires and so on, the goals tend to conflict. And so we're going to have to decide, even though we never seem to decide when we first intervene, which of those two goals we're more interested in right now. Now finally is one other set of considerations that next to the lessons that other dictators may draw, I think was probably the next biggest deficiency in terms of what ought to have been thought through before all this, before the intervention. And that is, well, two questions really. What will be required in rebuilding a new political and economic order in Libya if we assume either suddenly or through attrition the regime finally goes and the transitional council somehow takes power over all of Libya? And related to that, what is the nature of the international responsibility to assist that process? Part of the background in asking those questions is, in my judgment, that task of rebuilding a new, or building a new political and economic order is going to be immense, mainly because in the more than 4 decades of Gaddafi's rule, with his really weird structure of a Jamahiriya, supposedly government by the masses, he has done all he can to break down and destroy any kind of structure that we would describe as civil society, political society, organized political movements that could be the basis for a new order. That transitional council in the East has done the best they can, starting from scratch, not just militarily, but politically and everything else. It's very unlike, for example, Egypt right next door, where even though we had an authoritarian regime, and even though the ruling party, rigged elections, and the opposition parties were always going to have just a small number of seats, and even though the Muslim Brotherhood was officially illegal and so on, the fact was there were structures, there were opposition parties, there was a civil society, and most of that is simply missing in Libya. So we have to ask ourselves, how big is the task if Gaddafi goes, or when he goes? And secondly, especially given the Western intervention, what is the nature of the responsibility of the United States and Europe to assist that process? And one last final comment, not unrelated to that, is the concern about extremist influence in a new political order. I don't think this is just a scary diversion. The questions that have been asked by Secretary Gates and others referring to the opposition elements in Libya, basically, who are these people? How much do we really know about them? Represent well-founded concern about our lack of knowledge. This is one of those situations, if you look at the whole Arab Spring phenomenon, one of the situations about which it is most worth worrying with regard to extremist influence because of the chaos, because of the power vacuum that we're talking about. And I might add, Libyans, and more specifically Libyans from the east, by the way, from Cyrenaica, have been generously represented, really overrepresented proportionally in the ranks of transnational jihadist terrorists, in the likes of Al-Qaeda and so on. And indeed, it was opposing those figures that was one of the common concerns that the United States and Gaddafi's regime, going back to the late 90s and in the last couple of years of the Clinton administration, realized they shared and was the opening basis for the talks that led to that agreement in 2003. I will stop there and maybe we can get into questions while we're still waiting for the
Yes, since Ambassador Aujali is still not here, we are going to start the question period. When he arrives, we will stop and allow him to speak. But let me take the chair.